Welcome back, everyone. We got another KhAnubis video. We have what happened to the ancient Egyptian language. When we're talking Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, we're talking ancient Egyptian. I'm excited to learn about this. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we do lots of fun educational historical content just like this one. Let's jump into it, shall we?
Look at this sign in modern Cairo. Now take a look at these hieroglyphs from ancient Egypt. Aside from being written in completely different scripts, these two are written in completely different languages.
Right.
While Egypt today is the largest Arabic-speaking nation in the world,
I was about to say it's not even Egyptian, it's Arabic, yeah.
ancient Egypt used to have their own completely different language. So what I want to know is, what happened to the Egyptian language of antiquity? Does anyone still speak it? And how do you change the language of an entire country? For over 3,000 years, ancient Egypt spoke various forms of a language simply known as, well, Egyptian. But for the last 1,000 or so years, which in Egyptian terms is really not that long, the main language of the country has been Arabic.
Right.
In fact, modern Egypt primarily speaks its own dialect of Arabic, known as Egyptian Arabic.
And obviously we know this because this is where the Muslim expansion happened into this region in the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century. And even before that, the Roman Empire in like 5th century BC, or even before that, invaded. I can't remember.
Yeah, go figure. Now, Arabic and Egyptian are both related, but they're not the same thing. While both languages are part of the Afroasiatic language family, they belong to two separate branches of it. Of the 6 main branches of the Afroasiatic languages, Arabic is a Semitic language, butting up with languages like Hebrew, Aramaic, Amharic, and Akkadian, while Egyptian sort of does its own thing and makes up its own branch. I mean, maybe it had closer relatives, but considering how far back this language goes, it's honestly too hard for us to tell. Granted, it helps that Egypt was one of the first places in the world to develop writing, with things resembling records going as far back as the 33rd century BC. Or about 1,000 years before mammoths went completely extinct. In general,
Not mammoths, not in Egypt though. They were like in Siberia.
the Egyptian language's long history can be divided into 6 distinct phases. Archaic, which is mostly reconstructed because it's, really old. Old, middle, late, Demotic, and Coptic. And it's actually the last two that are crucial for answering our titular question.
Yeah, when invading forces took over.
One thing you have to know about ancient Egypt is that the society in general was very conservative. I mean, you can see it in their art style, as not much changed from the Old Kingdom all the way up to Ptolemaic Egypt. I mean, Akhenaten of course tried to change things around, but wow, did people not like what he did.
Don't know what he did. What did he do?
And while the language itself evolved, as all languages do when spoken by people as their native everyday language, official, legal, and religious inscriptions were generally written in older dialects. This was the case with Old Egyptian when Middle Egyptian first started to form, and then with Middle Egyptian until as relatively recently as the Roman era. It is perhaps also worth pointing out the nature of the hieroglyphics that made up their writing system. You can never just quickly jot down a series of hieroglyphs on a piece of paper.
Yeah, I don't think paper's even a thing. It could be, but I don't think it was. Like papyrus? Papyrus. Papyrus is a thing, I think. But this is this is like chiseled.
And that's because that's not what they were meant for. It was really only the priests, the ruling class, and the scribe class who knew how to read and write in this massive system of logograms, whose lexicon could number anywhere from 700 symbols to nearly 10,000, depending on which point of Egyptian history you're looking at.
It really becomes iconography at that point.
And so hieroglyphics were meant almost exclusively to be written on important things like legal papyri or grandiose temple walls.
Yeah.
To be fair, that's also generally the kind of stuff that survives for 3,000 years, but still. So I suppose if we had a similar system in English today, expect us to only be writing down things like, "Thou shalt not kill," or "All men are created equal," but not so much things like, the hieroglyphic.
No, that thing's definitely going to stay the test of time.
Hieroglyphic script was what is known as logography. Think Chinese characters where each glyph represents a word or an idea rather than an individual sound. But increasingly, some of these symbols would also be used as consonants, in a move which would actually be incredibly helpful to Egyptologists 3,000 years in the future, but more on that in a bit. In the 15th century BC, the New Kingdom of Egypt reached new heights that it never had before, but with new heights.
Yeah, they have the Levant all the way down to Ethiopia.
Also came new lows. The negative 12th century saw the beginning of a centuries-long decline in Egyptian power and influence as different dynasties from within vied for power. Well, this and the whole Bronze Age collapse thing, I suppose. This continued until 754 BC, when Egypt was conquered by the Nubian kingdom of Kush,
Right.
installing what historians today know as the 25th dynasty.
Yep.
It was probably called something different back then. As Egypt spent the next few hundred years under the rule of the Nubians, then the KhAnubis, Middle Egyptian still remained in use for governmental and religious affairs, while the language of the locals evolved into Demotic, whose name comes from the Greek demotikos, meaning common, and not to be confused with Demotic Greek, which is just the modern version of the Greek language, which is an Indo-European language like English and Farsi, so completely different language. And it was by this point the writing system had also begun to simplify. Over the centuries, a sort of cursive form of hieroglyphics called hieratic began to develop, and by
It's very close to Arabic.
the first millennium BC, this hieratic had evolved further into the Demotic script. Speaking of Greek, however, in 332 BC, Egypt was conquered from the Persians by Alexander the Great,
For a little
before he
bit.
went on to conquer Persia from Persia. After Alexander died in 323 BC, his general Ptolemy Soter called dibs on the former Egyptian satrap, installing his own dynasty and beginning the Ptolemaic kingdom. Like the kingdom of Kush with Meroitic and the Achaemenids with Aramaic, the Ptolemaic kingdom proclaimed Canaanite Greek as the language of government. Demotic, meanwhile, remained in common use.
And isn't this particular administration, wouldn't that produce Cleopatra?
Among the everyday folk of Egypt, with Middle Egyptian still used for religious affairs. This trilingualism can be seen today in perhaps the most famous document ever written in the Egyptian language, the Rosetta Stone.
Which, if you have it, I'll say this every time it ever comes up. The Rosetta Stone is the must-see thing at the British Museum. I think it's free entry in London. If you're ever in London, go to the British Museum. You have to reserve your time and go see the Rosetta Stone. It's so cool.
Well, maybe discounting the Book of the Dead. Middle Egyptian on top in hieroglyphics, Demotic as history's middle child, and Koine Greek on the bottom. Which was of course what helped people translate this giant text document 2,000 years later. Under the Roman era, things remained much the same linguistically, with Greek used as the language of government, as was actually the case across much of the eastern half of the empire, meaning Latin never actually made that much of an impact on Egypt like it did in northwestern Africa. Under Roman rule, the Egyptian language gradually evolved into a form known as Coptic, a language which actually survives to this day within the Coptic Church of Alexandria, whose name, by the way, comes from the same stem from which we get the word Egypt, which is of course not what the ancient Egyptians called their land. No, the ancient endonym for Egypt was Kemet, and if you're wondering what the modern Arabic name for the country is, it's Misr, or Mus in Egyptian Arabic. During this time, Egypt saw the gradual decline of its old beliefs and the rise of Christianity. However, as the 3rd century was generally a bad time to be a Christian within sight of the Mediterranean, as confirmed by the persecutions overseen by Emperor Diocletian, many Egyptian Christians established monasteries out in the desert, many of which are still in operation 1700 years later, where important texts were translated from Greek into the new Coptic dialect by Saint Shenouda. Coptic evolved hand in hand with the Coptic alphabet, a modified version of the Greek alphabet, with a few extra letters borrowed from simplified hieroglyphs for certain sounds that Greek letters just couldn't really imitate, like ch, ch, this one's pronounced differently depending on dialect, t, and numbers. I suppose Greek could have satisfied some of those, but still, you do you. Eventually, being Christian in Egypt went from being more or less banned to being more or less enforced, with the old Egyptian religion dwindling down, symbolically ending when Justinian
It's just beautiful beautiful monuments and obelisks right there.
the first ordered the temple of Isis at Philae to be closed. Ha, take that, I've closed your building. Now go to a church or something. Actually, forget the something, just go to a church. Thus, Middle Egyptian faded out entirely, with Coptic assuming the same role for the new faith, particularly after 451, when the Council of Chalcedon split the churches of Constantinople and Alexandria. But in order to fully understand the story of Rat Nikumat, we have to look at the history of Masri. By 642, Egypt had been absorbed into the rapidly growing Rashidun Caliphate.
Right, which we're also learning about right now. The caliphate that spawned out of Muhammad and furthermore.
For the first 100 or so years, Arabic was mostly the language of the rulers, military, and recently arrived Arab immigrants. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Arabic had grown significantly in Egypt due to Arab migration and mass conversion to Islam, for which of course Arabic is the important liturgical language. Basically, throughout this time, Arabic became the language of government and religion. Coincidentally, the two things you do not bring up when traveling to a new country. And over time, it became increasingly so that Arabic was just, like, a really good idea for your average Egyptian to learn, especially those living in the shiny new capital, Cairo. By the 11th century, even many texts within the Coptic Church were being translated into Arabic. This trend only continued and eventually accelerated with the periodic persecution of Copts and Christians, with Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr-Allah banning the language in literally every context, even going so far as to personally walk the streets of Cairo and eavesdrop on people's homes to hear if they were speaking the language.
That's crazy.
And thus by 1200, Coptic had become little more than a classical language. While isolated communities further up the Nile in Upper Egypt may have still spoken the language throughout the Mamluk and Ottoman periods, and even into the 19th century, Egypt had more or less completely transitioned into an Arabic-speaking nation, with Coptic relegated to the ceremonial language of the Orthodox minority. No surprise, contemporary speakers of Coptic also played an important role in helping decipher the Rosetta Stone, and through that its own ancient ancestors and the hieroglyphs they wrote in, especially with figuring out where the vowels went, because y'all know no Afro-Asiatic language ever be writing vowels. I mean, I guess Coptic literally does, but still, you ever try learning Arabic or Hebrew? Egyptian does the same thing. It's frustrating if you're so Indo-European-brained. In fact, if you want the full story on how we were able to reconstruct ancient Egyptian, I would highly recommend this video from Nativelang. Actually, that wasn't a recommendation, that was an order. This is your homework now.
We'll go check it out, okay?
On my desk by Thursday. While the Egyptian language may today be extinct, save for a distant descendant in one specific church, you don't get to be the language of one of the most important civilizations in history and not have some sort of influence to this day. English words like barge, natron, oasis, and possibly even paper and elephants can all be traced back to the Egyptian language. And oh yeah, Egyptian hieroglyphs are the ancestor of most of the writing systems used around the world to this day, from Latin to Arabic to potentially Devanagari and Thai. Quite the influence for a 5,000-year-old language, I'd say.
I mean, that makes sense though. Like any Mesopotamian / like early civilization language is going to have influence to this day just because it breeds new languages. So, I mean, that makes sense. Oh, that's it. Interesting stuff, you know. What happened to the ancient Egyptian language? I want to learn a little bit more about languages as well. There's a lot of languages. If we cut out all the tribal languages, there's like a good 60, 70, but there's thousands of tribal languages. But the majority of people speak like 60 to 70 different languages. I think language barriers almost dehumanize us. What I mean by that is like it's harder to relate to someone when there's not common communication, and communication is everything. It's the most important thing. Communication is the most important thing. Because if we can't communicate with each other, you can't hear me. You can't understand me. So, yeah, language is so important. Gotta study it, gotta learn it, gotta figure out how to cross-collaborate with it. And love these AI tools and all these translation things because they're so unique and boundaries are continuously crossed that way. Appreciate you watching this. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a video recommendation down below. Peace out. Bye-bye.